Damon Lindelof, when all is said and done, and you've read all the feedback, and you've done everything you possibly can to make this show what you wanted it to be, do you now finally feel a little bit of closure?
Yeah, I guess closure is something that you either feel a lot of or none at all, or else it's not really closure. So, um, I'm definitely feeling closure. It feels over and in the best possible way imaginable.
Now, Damon, one thing I love about your writing is that not only are you like extremely inventive, I think, like with the international assassin world, all that kind of stuff, but you also do something that's increasingly rare in television these days, which is like having these great twists that like nobody sees coming. Even though everybody's picking apart Mr. Robot, Westworld several weeks in advance. So I'm thinking like when you have the missing girls, and then kind of nobody figured out that they were with the guilty remnant, or even going back to Lost when you had a bunch of characters just carrying around a box for half a season and nobody really knew what was up, but in hindsight it seems like very obvious. So how are you doing this hiding twist kind of in plain sight?
That's a great question. And the answer is sometimes you have to surprise yourself. I think that one of the great things about television writing in general is how highly collaborative it is. And so the fact that on all the shows that I've worked on, there's just an incredible staff of other writers, so they can surprise you with their pitches. And so you come in with half of an idea, or that's actually probably not entirely accurate. I'd say like 1/10 of an idea. The fun is filling in the other 9/10. So in the case of the missing girls in the second season of The Leftovers, Tom Spezialy comes in and brings Picnic at Hanging Rock, which I'm sure is a movie that Rob is familiar with, one of the great pieces of Australian cinema. And that movie has like a disclaimer at the beginning of it saying, hey, we're never going to resolve this mystery where these girls went. And I was like, okay, so if we're gonna steal from Hanging Rock, we've got to go one better, and we've got to answer it. Where did these girls go? And so the writers all start kind of riffing on. We knew that they had faked their own departure, and then the question becomes why. And in that case, it was Jacqueline Hoyt, one of the writer producers on the show, and she said, "Well, they joined the guilty remnant." And when she said it, it felt so completely and totally obvious, but it surprised me. And I said, "Well, if I'm making the show, if I'm writing the show, and I'm surprised, maybe the viewers will too." But I think that there's this other technique that we're seeing employed more and more, which I'll refer to as the Trojan horse, which is give the audience a twist that they can probably figure out, and then they stop looking for other twists. So you mentioned Mr. Robot, for example, where I think that a lot of the audience had basically crowdsourced. Oh, I think that spoiler alert, Christian Slater is not real. He's a figment of Elliot's imagination. But what we didn't see was that his sister had been there all along, Darlene, right beside him. And so you give them the twist that they can guess, and then they stop looking. But there are others that are still kind of hiding in plain sight, and I think that's a cool way to do it. Westworld, another case of that is who is the man in black, what's his relationship to Jimmy Simpson, etc. But that forced us to focus on that storyline and not think about what Anthony Hopkins had been up to all along. So I think that having kind of multiple twists and surprises is sort of the key. But ultimately, I think as a storyteller, if you get too focused on the twists and the narrative leaps, and you forget about the emotions that the characters are experiencing, or how they're experiencing these twists, etc., then you kind of get lost in the weeds. So I would rather have people guess what it is we're up to, and then be surprised by the behaviors of the characters, and they're still engaged by the story. I think that's kind of the brass ring we're all reaching for.
Mm. And a lot of The Leftovers is about oh, such a cliche now, but like letting the mystery be, you know,
I love
that's
cliches.
cliches are great. I think they're
They
so
are.
easy, so easy. So letting the mystery be is a big part of the leftovers. We finished the finale, and I'm sure there's some random person from Idaho on Reddit who probably came up with maybe guessed what was going to happen, but I didn't see it coming, and it really, really affected me personally and profoundly. I loved it, I really did,
Oh, thanks, Rob.
and Riley and I have talked about this at length because we have differing views. But I don't want to be in a world where what Nora was saying isn't true. So I just am very happy to go along with whatever the hell she was telling Kevin, because it was probably either her truth or she was telling him that for a reason, or it actually happened. But in any event, I want to believe it. But I'm sure now you're going to cop that a lot, right? You're going to be getting a lot of people saying to you, "Oh, now was it true? Did it actually happen? Did she go into the bubble?" And I'm wondering if you can just talk to that particular point, given that that's only happened a week ago for us.
Yeah, I've been sort of surprised by the number of people who haven't asked me that. In terms of, I think that the default position really is where you are, Rob. Which I've had the experience now of watching the finale in a room full of people who are seeing it for the first time. We did a screening in New York about 4 days before the finale actually aired, and then we did a screening in Los Angeles basically the night that the finale had aired. And so they didn't have the opportunity to turn and talk to anyone else about it. They didn't go onto the net and read think pieces, and certainly not go down the rabbit hole of Reddit. And so you're just sort of left with, how did you experience this in the moment that it happened, before someone even said to you, but what if Nora wasn't telling the truth? What was your subjective emotional response to the story in the moment that it was being told? And I think that most people default, and this is a broad generalization and completely and totally anecdotal, and you have to decide whether or not you believe me in telling it to you, but they default at your position, which is, I want to believe this story, and the fact that I believe it actually transcends my curiosity about whether or not it is true. And Parada, I think, who I've spent some time with over the course of the past week in kind of the post gaming, he says, isn't that kind of religion writ large, which is, you kind of, if it's a nicer story and you want to believe it, can't you just stay in that space and not question its reality? Because I think you can take any belief system, another spoiler alert, but to say Santa Claus, for example, or Father Christmas, as you would call him down under, like when a kid basically first learns that there is information out there that seems to contradict the existence of Santa Claus, they will hold on to that belief system as long as humanly possible. And then even once they know that there is no Santa Claus, they still want to continue to play the game, because believing that someone is leaving them presents is just much more interesting and exciting than their parents doing it. And I think that's a way of looking at it. At the same time, I don't want to cop out and say whatever the audience believes is what matters. It's what matters to you. I do think that we had a really clear intention in the story that we told, that intention evolved over time, and all I can say to you is that we wrote the script. We never talked to Carrie Coon or Mimi Leader about whether or not Nora's story was true. There it was on the page. They both interpreted it and extrapolated it in their own way, and then the audience sort of experienced the episode. I was standing there in Clunes, Australia, several hours outside of Melbourne, and when I saw her read it for the first time, and Mimi called cut, and I turned to Tom and I said, I think I believe her.
Yeah.
And make of that as you will, but it is a nicer story for sure.
Can you talk about Kevin, and then also Lost on Jack on Lost? They're kind of non-believers, and sometimes you say that they're non-believers in worlds that are kind of much more fantastical than ours. So can you talk about why that distinction is important, or whether it is?
I think it's very important. I think that both of those characters, they're made up fictional pretend people, but they are, every character is a byproduct of yourself in some way, if you're a writer trying to put it out there. And I'd say that I've always approached the world with kind of an agnostic viewpoint. I believe in what's right in front of me, and if something is presented to me, no matter how fantastical and how much I want to believe in it, my mind struggles with the process of grasping at the supernatural and the fantastic. It's much easier for me not to believe than it is to believe, and it is sometimes very upsetting when something happens outside of the way that you understand the world to be. That happened on November 8th for many, many Americans last year, and perhaps members of the world, which is, we saw the world in one way, and then something else happened, and you have to question your own belief systems about the the way the morality works, the way that humans think and feel, et cetera, et cetera. But for me, the journey of sort of unpacking surprises and the amazing and the supernatural and the otherworldly is really something that's interesting to me personally, and I want the storytelling to reflect that as much as possible.
Yeah. Going on a slightly different tangent, it's very hard for me to put into words how important and moving it was to see my country depicted on an American TV series. And I think you did a really beautiful job of just kind of portraying it very genuinely. And, like the indigenous culture, we don't get to see a lot of that on TV. And David Goldblum is an amazing actor. And so all that stuff really was beautiful to watch. And you've talked at length about why you came here. But I'd like to know, now that you've been here and you've worked here, what surprised you about what Australia offered to The Leftovers in season 3?
Well, thanks so much for saying that, because it means a lot to us that, particularly if you are an Australian from any part of Australia, and as you know, to say all Australians are the same, there's obviously a wide range of people who live down there, and different. Someone who lives in Sydney is having a different experience than someone who's living in Perth, and someone's living in Adelaide, and someone who's living in an Indigenous community. And we didn't have many episodes to sort of reflect all those ideas, but we wanted to reflect them with some degree of authenticity. And here's an area where I just have to give a tremendous amount of credit to Mimi Leader, to Tom Spezialy, Gene Kelly, who went down to Australia and spent, almost a couple months there before we started principal photography, spent a lot of time with the indigenous community. We had an indigenous community consultant who essentially read the scripts and, in the most kind and generous way said, this is crazy white fella thinking, which is what we ended up naming one of the episodes. But it was sort of important for us to be corrected, to be told, hey, if you want to get it right, you sort of need to understand a little bit more of the nuance here, to not just mythologize, but also talk about some of the more uncomfortable aspects of Australian culture, the guilt that many of the white members of Australian culture have about the way that the Indigenous community as it relates to the stolen generation. And so the idea was never to kind of talk down to anyone, but present it in its most sort of authentic way possible, to not make fun of Australians. I think that you guys have an amazing ability to make fun of yourselves, but it's much different because we're doing the show through an American lens. Just because you make fun of yourselves, that doesn't entitle us to make fun of you. So we took a character like Kevin Sr., who brilliantly played by Scott Glenn, and made him the butt of the joke. I feel like all the Australians are actually, I won't say smarter, but I will say slightly more ahead of the series than some of the American characters who have traveled down there and are seeking to appropriate the Australianness of Australia, but they're getting so many things wrong that a lot of the comedy was sort of derived from that. And to put ourselves in the perspective of, just because we went down there for a couple of months and read a bunch of books, that doesn't make us experts. The only true experts of the Australian experience are people who have been living there for years. So I think that finding the right tone and the right sense of perspective was really key to us.
So that's one big change that we had this season, moving to Australia. Another that was more immediate was everybody had a beard. So I was just wondering if you could speak to that. I mean, I've seen Justin Theroux talk about how he grew it, but somehow in like the 600 interviews that you've done this year, I haven't seen a mention of it.
601?
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, seen a mention of why everybody has beards?
Exactly. Like it's not just like Kevin, John, Matt, but it's also people like Bill Kemp. He comes back and he's got this big beard.
I love that you're asking me this question. So basically,
I'm very jealous is what it is.
Yeah, no, it's hard to grow a good beard. So as you know from Lost, I've had mixed luck with beards. Even though the season 3 finale of Lost is one of its most widely celebrated, the worst part of that episode, hands down, is Jack Shephard's fake beard. And so we knew that we wanted Kevin to have a beard for the 3rd season because we were doing this running idea that he was being perceived as some sort of messianic character and was being directly and indirectly compared to Jesus Christ. And so we had this great joke that Matt Jameson would say, oh, yeah, no, I don't think you're Jesus, but the beard looks good on you, that required Justin to grow his beard. And so we did ask Justin to grow a beard between the seasons. And then what started happening was the actors, Eccleston first, he emailed and basically said, hey, I have a beard right now. Do you want me to shave it? And here's a selfie. And I was like, oh, he looks pretty cool with the beard. Don't shave it. And then 2 days later, Kevin Carroll emailed, hey, I've got a beard right now. Should I shave it? And I was like, oh, no, keep the beard going. And then same thing with Bill Camp. He's like, I grew a beard after Night Of. Should I shave it? And then it was like, I can't believe this is happening. Everyone keep your beards. So it was not by design. It was by fortuitous coincidence and or the universe wanting there to be as many beards as humanly possible. Also, like, beards are cool now, I guess. Like, that's a big, I don't know what it's like in Canada or Australia, but the hipsters have sort of like, the beard is the kind of default. It's the earring of 2016, 17. Before the fad goes cold, we wanted to capitalize it on it as much as possible.
Wow. So there was no great mystery to that. There's nothing we had to read into that. It was just the guys wanted to have beards. So that's cool.
Yes, the guys wanted to have beards.
That's cool. I understand that completely. Also, speaking of some of the funnier or lighter parts of the show, well, not even that, but something that a lot of us now kind of smile about. I think you tried to go out of your way to make season 3 break all records for full frontal nudity, especially episode 5, even the finale for Carrie Coon, but full frontal, especially in episode 5, it wasn't confronting, but it was like, what are you guys up to? Was that intentional?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is done with a little bit of a wink. I mean, I think that there's an expectation, not just of prestige TV, but also of HBO, to basically, we can, so shouldn't we? But we end up seeing the same kind of nudity, which is almost always in a sexual context, and it's unfortunately like 90-10 female nudity versus male nudity, unfortunately. And I think that we made an effort to sort of look at it in both ways, which is like we're only going to use nudity if it's basically demonstrating like either insanity or some deep degree of character vulnerability. This idea of when you are naked, you are sort of at your most exposed, your most stripped down. So the idea of visualizing that, and I think Game of Thrones, which eats a lot of shit for gratuitous nudity. The most impactful nudity that show has done in all of its seasons was Cersei's walk of shame, and the way that they use nudity to such incredible power, as opposed to just sexually. Although sexuality is clearly a part of it for that character, but I think that you see that there are other ways to use it, and so whenever we use it with great intention, and that hopefully we're trying to use it in some sort of emotional, or yes, in some case comedic construct. But in the second season of the show, Eccleston has to get naked and put himself in the stocks, and he really there was a way to shoot that where we would have not shown his genitalia, and he absolutely insisted on I want people to see it. And I was like, well, yeah, great. They should. I want to see it. Because if he's humbling himself before God, and obviously, oh my God, Eccleston's volunteering, he must be hung. But he's not thinking about it in those terms. It's not braggadocio. He really isn't thinking in terms of the character. So there were cases where, Nora and Kevin could have been naked, like in the airport bathroom, and we didn't want them to be, because they're covering themselves up. They're hiding something from one another. And then there's moments like in the finale where Nora has to basically get into the ladder, where it felt like it was absolutely essential for her to be completely naked. And I don't want to walk around the world naked unless I'm in the presence of the people that I trust and care about most, namely my wife. And so to ask an actor to get naked in front of the entire crew, but then understand that they're going to be naked in front of millions of people, or in the case of Lost, Leftovers, hundreds of people, when it eventually airs. That's a big deal. And so if you're asking actors to do that, A, you've got to be very picky about when you ask them to do it, but B, they should really understand why you're asking them to do it. And fortunately, over the 3 seasons of the show, all of the actors that we ever asked to be naked were totally game to do so, because I think that they felt like it was a reflection of character and it was appropriate.
When I watched Leftovers, I spent a lot of time thinking about, like, how is this different from Lost? Like, nudity is obviously one, but I'm also wondering, like, are you consciously trying to subvert expectations that, like, I and others have from that series? Like, I just think about the musical score, where in Lost you had, like, a different theme for, like, every character. In the Leftovers, you've kind of got, like, a couple really memorable themes that you use a lot, and you use, like, existing songs. And then in, like, the series finale, a lot of the Leftovers series finale, I kind of thought, like, is this going to end exactly the same way, in, like, a Flash Sideways kind of world where things are slightly different? So how much time do you spend, are you conscious of that all the time?
Yeah, I have to be conscious of it, because I feel like I have a bag of tricks, and the tricks that get the most oohs and ahs, and audience response are the ones that I'm most likely to use over and over again. And I have to be cognitive of the fact that it's why a magician, if they do a card trick for you and you say, do that again, that they don't, because they know that it will be a little less special the second time they do it, but they also know that you'll be watching their hands more closely the second time around. And I will say that I think it's totally fair to compare Lost and The Leftovers, because I was involved in both of them, and fortunately for me, but unfortunately for all my collaborators, this is an auteur-driven business, and so a disproportionate amount of credit for The Leftovers is given to me. But I can't say enough times how many other architects there are of this show. And so being open and receptive to other ideas that didn't come from me, trying to push my own ego aside, because when I hear a great idea, the first thing that occurs to me is, that wasn't my idea, I hate it. And then it goes to, I wish that idea is so good, I wish I'd come up with it. And then, like, that idea is really good, it's got to be in the show. So, but when I hear something that feels like it is like something that we did on Lost, I have an aversion to it, because A, I don't want to go back to that bag of tricks, but B, I don't want it to feel like a trick. You know, trick is not a good word. It seems to suggest that you pulled the wool over somebody's eyes. And so I want to honor all the things that made Lost special. But I guess what I want to more replicate from Lost is what the emotional experience of watching it was, sort of a character-centric version of storytelling and an exploration of these themes between both shows, grief and loss, trying to understand the world around us, what happens when we die, you know, what are the connections that we make with strangers that could be lasting. Those are ideas that permeate both things, but those thematic ideas are so big, there's got to be different ways to explore them. And so I do get tickled by doing something new, whether it came from my brain or usually in the case of The Leftovers, someone else's brain. But yeah, I would be full of shit to say to you, what? I never think of Lost. You know, like, who cares? That was, you know, it's been over for 7 years now. Let's get beyond it. It was the fundamental creative experience of my life. I'm really proud of my involvement in it, but I feel like I owe myself and I owe the audience not just a rehashing of those ideas, but an evolution of them.
When I talk to most people about The Leftovers, many people
they say, "What is that? What are you talking about?"
You
should throw them away after 2 days because they go bad.
Yeah, basically, and they're not good for you. You get tummy trouble. But they all seem to really want to talk about Patti Levin. There's something about that character, and it was a huge secret that she was coming back. I mean, we all knew if you were going to go revisit that International Assassin world, she'd probably make an appearance, but no one really knew until many of us saw it a few weeks before it aired, and then we had to keep our mouths shut. And she's a really interesting character. I think Kevin facilitates her letting go in season 2, and I think she then kind of returns the favor in season 3. And when I spoke to her the other day, she said it was the most profound experience of her life. She really did. She talked at length about working on the show. So I'd just like to hear from you what it was like working with Ann Dowd, and why is that character? Why do we love her so much?
I think that I'll start with the last part of your question, which is I think that the reason that you love her so much is because of Ann Dowd. And we do our part in the writer's room, and obviously Patti Levin was a character who existed in Tom's initial book, but we all felt like there was real opportunity, that she was the closest thing that the show had to a big bad. You know, who's the primary antagonist here? It's Patti Levin. Right in the pilot, Kevin is essentially saying that the guilty remnant represents all these horrific ideas. They are tearing families apart. So who is the ringleader of that? And then I always want to sort of understand, okay, why is this person behaving that way? And one of the many therapists that has tried to make me a less miserable person over the years once said to me, there's no such emotion as anger. Anger is just fear or sadness in disguise, camouflaged. Every time you've ever been angry in your life, it's because you were scared or because you were sad. And in my case, that felt very true. And so Patti Levin is a very angry character. So what is she scared of? What is she sad about? And then we began to kind of try to unpack those ideas. And the unpacking of those ideas eventually led to the revelation of who Neil was and how abusive he was. But also, even when she was a little girl, she was basically sublimated. And I think that The Leftovers, and particularly The Guilty Remnant, is a very female-centric ideology, just in terms of the way that the show deals with emotion. And the GR was matriarchal. And so how do you have someone who's motherly, but also like the bad guy? That felt like it was the new idea. And Anne just is not a bad guy in any way, shape, and form, but she is incredibly matriarchal. And she basically formed a relationship with myself, with Parada, everyone on the crew, all the writers, but most specifically Thoreau. And they just had this sort of beautiful relationship. So it's like, here are these people who are locked in battle with one another, and one is the son and one is the mother. We've all seen the other version ad nauseum, father and son, you know, Darth and Luke, like a billion times before, where the dad is the bad guy. I've never seen the mom be the bad guy before. And then when she exits the stage, we feel this tremendous amount of sympathy for her. When we brought her back for the final season, I think, Rob, as you just illuminated, our intention was, in the first journey into that realm, Kevin was helping her, although he thought that he was getting rid of her because she was annoying him or haunting him. But in the end, the only way he could do so was by gaining empathy for her, by hearing her story, and she just crushed it. But we knew that if we were going to bring her back, it had to be in a slightly different context. We actually started talking about the Terminator movies. It was like, at the end of Terminator, Arnold Schwarzenegger is the bad guy. They destroy him, but he's back in T2, and now he's the good guy. We started to think of Patti Levin in the same way, which is Kevin actually summons her. He wants her, both subconsciously and consciously, to help him through this ordeal. She's the only one who can. And this all kind of goes back to Patti telling Kevin right before she kills herself, "You understand." There is this sort of like incredible bond between these two characters that transcends words, but they're just kindred spirits in some way. But it's all Anne. And I also have to give a tremendous amount of credit to Craig Zobel, who directed both those episodes, not to mention Lens from the second season, which is an entirely different kind of episode than the International Assassin episodes. And then Mimi Leader, who came on in episode 5 of season 1, which is the first time that Patti really speaks. She takes Laurie to this diner. Mimi was really a massive architect alongside Anne in helping define that character.
Riley, have you got a final question? We might have to let Damon go eventually. We could keep him here today, but
let's just keep it going. Keep it rolling. 24-hour marathon.
Yeah.
The last couple of times we saw Patti, it was in the International Assassin world, where everybody's kind of dead, or something's up. They're kind of in limbo. But this season we actually met David Burton, and he is alive kind of after season 2. So I'm wondering, what was he doing in that world?
David Burton basically lives in what I will call the 2% space, which is Parada and I, when we were first talking about the show, his position was that the world of the leftovers was the normal world and functioned according to the rules of the normal world, with the one exception of the sudden departure. That was it. This one crazy supernatural thing happened, and then we snapped back to the normal world. And I was like, yes, but the potential for more supernatural strangeness to come would be living in the space of, do I treat this as supernatural or do I treat this as natural? Because now I'm living in a world where the departure happened. And so I said to him, will you at least give me 2%? Because you say 98% of the world stayed, 2% goes. Like, when all is said and done and we look at the 3 seasons of The Leftovers as a whole, or I think at the time we were having this conversation, I just said the series as a whole, we'll be able to look back on it and say 98% of it did take place in the natural world, but 2% was in the unnatural or supernatural world. I'm putting David Burton in that category, which basically means that the less said about him, the better. I guess, to not be completely and totally evasive to someone who's spent so much time investing themselves in Lost, I at least owe you an explanation beyond that the show has to speak for itself. But what I would say is that I think that David Burton is a supernatural character, but he is most definitely not God. Okay.
That's good to know. Yeah, I was wondering the same thing. For a final question, I was going to go down the Emmys road. We did that last time when we spoke, and frankly, we spend so much time talking about The Leftovers and how many Emmy nominations it deserves. And if it gets nominations this year, then that's wonderful. I'll run through the house screaming in tears. If it doesn't, then you'll see all the articles about how it was the most snubbed show on television. So instead, I just wanted to mention that, but I'm not going to ask you about that. And what I'd rather know is because
Wait. I just want to know that you will also run through the house screaming in tears if there are no nominations. I want to know that
uh,
I want the same reaction in both
it'll be a
scenarios.
different tears. I'll be very, very
Okay.
upset. I won't be able to speak because,
Okay.
you know, Riley and I have gone over this ad nauseum, how we're going to be very upset if the Academy doesn't take notice of season 3. But that being said, it's out of our control. Hopefully it will
Yes.
happen. But what I'd really like to know is, because when I speak of The Leftovers and when I think about it, I think about, okay, what did I most take out of the show? There's a lot of aspects I loved about what you did on this show, but I loved how it talks about grief, and it actually has given me so much more perspective about how I deal with my own grief. And I'd like to know what you take away from it and what you'll think about in years to come when you look back on your experience on this show.
Oh, wow. Softball. I don't know what I'll be thinking about years from now. I can only really speak to what I was thinking about when it began and extrapolate that from what I'm feeling now, which is that, and this is the cool thing about grief, despite the fact that it's not a feeling that anybody wants to be feeling, but it's also a feeling that everyone who's human is going to feel at some point. And it's unavoidable. And it's a beautiful thing, I think, because we are wired to be empathic. We are wired to care and connect. We are wired to form bonds with people, even though we know that the inevitability of that situation is that we're going to lose them or they're going to lose us. You'll very often see a couple who's deeply in love, and one of them will say, I just want you to go before me, because I won't be able to live without you. And I think that's the most arrogant, horrific thing to say, because you want them to have all the bad feelings and you're spared it. The more noble thing to say is, you can go first because I don't want you to feel the grief. And yet, grieving is a process. And that's why I'm saying, there is an end to it. There is an understanding. It's necessary for us to sort of understand our own mortality. I think children don't grieve in the same way that adults do because they're still functionally immortal. But the older we get and the more people that we lose, or if we experience some degree of illness, we start to feel like the world isn't fair. Grief becomes the way that we process all these unpleasant emotions. But the amazing thing about it is that there is an end to it. You'll always be sad, but I've been to funerals and even wakes a week after someone has died, and there's laughter at those funerals. Someone will crack a joke about the person who has died, and that's part of grieving too. And I think that there's such a wide range of human emotions that are all packed into grief. Grief represents all of it. It's denial and anger and bargaining and depression and acceptance. The Kubler-Ross scale, but then all these other things. And I just wanted to make a show that replicated the feeling of grief so that people who have gone through it don't feel so alone. And that people who haven't experienced yet can kind of get a sense of what it's going to be for them without being scared of it, but understanding that this is part of being human and there is beauty in it, sadness and anger and upset, a lot, all negative, but there are wonderful things to be mined too. So that's what we set out to achieve. And I think that I've said all I have to say about grief as an artist at this point in my life. Probably whatever I do next will certainly incorporate what I've learned, but it won't be the deep dive on it. But I feel like that's what the goal was to sort of evolve beyond Lost, which looked at grief in sort of a more abstract way through the lens of identity and supernaturality. Maybe we've made it feel a little more real this time around.
Yeah, I think you definitely have. Damon, we could literally just talk for hours and hours, but we will let you go. We really appreciate your time and we appreciate The Leftovers. Great. Congratulations on that show. It will stay with me for a very long time, and I'm sure Riley feels the same way. Thanks very much, mate. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for all the time that you guys have invested in this. for unpacking it so deeply. Thank you, Rob, for waking up at 6 a.m. in the midst of the Australian winter to talk to me. But most importantly, thanks for talking to all the actors and directors on the show. You know, you mentioned Emmys, and I do feel like I have to say, like, to give Mimi Leader a nomination, or to give, you know, Carrie or Justin or Anne or Christopher or Amy or anyone I've left out, like, that would be the dream, because they've worked so hard, and in my opinion, my subjective opinion, they just did extraordinary work. So thank you for giving us the attention. I know it's still a long shot and we're still a dark horse, but it at least we'll get snubbed this year. That's progress.
Definitely.